He'd survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 federal indictments, and one truly cursed blind date arranged by his mother. But nothing in Kang Min-jae's kill-or-be-killed resume had prepared him for the moment a woman in a bookstore apartment would ask him to choose between an empire and a heartbeat. If you believe love deserves one more night, even when empires, arranged marriages, and backstabbing syndicate bosses try to steal it, hit subscribe right now. Like this video if you're already Team Min-jae and Amara. Only the cold, calculating traitors plotting in boardrooms wouldn't smash that like button. Don't be a Choi. Subscribe. Seoul doesn't sleep. It just changes costumes. By day, it's a city of glass towers and iced Americanos. The kind of place where college students argue about K-pop comebacks and grandmothers sell roasted chestnuts on corners worth more than most countries' GDP. By night, the costume comes off, and underneath is something older. A city built on rice paddies and revenge, where 12 families had spent 3 generations trading territory the way other people trade recipes. Bloodier, though. Less garlic. Kang Min-jae ran the largest of those 12 families, and he did it the way most successful men do everything. Quietly, efficiently, and with the faint, permanent exhaustion of someone whose to-do list included both renegotiate shipping routes and figure out what to do about the body in Warehouse 6. People called him the Reaper of Junggu, which he found hilarious, mostly because the actual scariest thing about him was his spreadsheet game. Rivals feared his silence. His accountant feared his font choices. He'd built his empire on one rule: never let emotion outrun logic. It had kept him alive through 2 attempted coups, one poisoning that ruined a perfectly good bowl of galbatang, and more boardroom betrayals than a Korean drama writer could invent on caffeine alone. Cold, precise, untouchable, except on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and, if he was being honest, most Sundays too. Because 3 nights a week, the most feared man in Seoul's underworld did something none of his enemies would have believed if you'd shown them security footage. He disappeared. No convoy. No men in dark suits pretending to read newspapers upside down. Just a hoodie, 2 sizes too casual for a man who owned 4 tailors, and a 15-minute walk to a crooked little bookstore in Ixyeondong, where a narrow staircase in the back led up to an apartment that smelled like cinnamon candles and paperbacks instead of gunmetal and cigars. That apartment belonged to Amara. Amara was, by underworld standards, a walking occupational hazard, because she was the one person in Min-jae's life who was completely, aggressively unimpressed by him. She didn't flinch at his name. She'd never once asked about the scar along his knuckles, mostly because she was far more interested in the fact that he couldn't fold a fitted sheet to save his empire. "You survived 3 assassination attempts," she'd told him once, holding up the sheet like evidence in a trial, "and this defeated you. That sheet," Min-jae had said, dead serious, "is clearly working for a rival family." She'd laughed so hard, she nearly dropped her wine. And in that laugh, Min-jae had found something no title, no territory, and no amount of blood-soaked golf courses could ever buy him: the terrifying, addictive feeling of being ordinary. With her, he wasn't an empire. He was just a man who burned toast, told terrible puns, and got scolded for leaving his shoes in the doorway like a menace to polite society. He'd stopped believing he deserved ordinary a long time ago. Amara made him forget that belief every single week. That fragile, borrowed ordinary shattered on a Tuesday. It started with a phone call at 6 a.m. Never a good sign, since the only people who called Min-jae before sunrise were either dead by lunch or about to make someone else that way. By 9 a.m., the heads of the rival syndicates were seated in his estate's meeting room, sipping tea like men who hadn't spent the last decade trying to have each other killed. They came with an offer wrapped in velvet and lined with steel: a marriage. Min-jae to the daughter of the Choi family, Seoul's second most powerful and most recently most furious syndicate. A union to end a war before its first bullet left the chamber. Refuse, and the streets would run red with a fight that wouldn't care which of its victims wore a suit and which one just worked the corner store. It wasn't a request. It was arithmetic. One marriage against 1,000 funerals. And even the Reaper of Junggu understood exactly which number a man in his position was supposed to choose. He said nothing in that meeting. He simply nodded, the way men like him always did before deciding whether to burn the world down or let it burn them first. Because somewhere across the city, in a small apartment above a bookstore, a woman with a smile that never asked him to be anyone but himself was about to find out that some Tuesdays don't just end quietly. Some Tuesdays end everything. Min-jae had negotiated with cartel enforcers who smiled with their teeth and threatened with their eyes. He had once sat across from a man who tried to have him killed twice, sipping the same cup of tea, both of them pretending the poison rumors were exaggerated. None of that compared to standing outside Amara's door with the truth in his pocket like a live grenade with the pin already pulled. He knocked 3 times. Same as always. She opened it in an oversized cardigan and fuzzy socks, hair wrapped, holding a spoon she was clearly still using on something in the kitchen. "You're early," she said, squinting at him. "Did the underworld go on strike? Or did you finally get fired from being terrifying?" Something like that. She noticed it before he said a word. The stillness in him. The kind that wasn't his usual calm, but something heavier. Something borrowed from a funeral. Amara had spent 2 years learning the difference between Min-jae's silences. This one had a different weight. "Okay," she said slowly, setting the spoon down like she already knew whatever came next would ruin dinner. "Sit. Talk." He didn't sit. Powerful men rarely do when they're about to lose the only argument that ever mattered. He told her everything. The meeting, the tea. Nobody drank for pleasure. The arithmetic of one marriage against 1,000 funerals. He told her about the Choi family, about alliances stitched together with old blood and older grudges, about how refusing wasn't bravery. It was just a slower, uglier way of killing the same number of people. Amara listened without interrupting, which somehow made it worse. When he finished, the apartment held a silence so complete he could hear the record player's static in the next room, waiting for a song neither of them would be able to finish tonight. "So," she said finally, voice steady in a way that cost her everything to fake, "you're telling me the city needs you to marry a stranger to stop a war?" "Yes. And if you don't? Then the war finds people who never signed up for it. Shopkeepers, kids walking home, people who think syndicate is just a word from movies." He exhaled. "I've spent my whole life making sure blood stays where it belongs, in boardrooms, not sidewalks. I can't be the reason that changes." Amara nodded slowly, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding her ribs together by will alone. "You know," she said with a small, brittle laugh, "for a man who runs an empire built on fear, you're remarkably bad at asking for what you actually want." "What I want," Min-jae said quietly, "isn't an option tonight." And there it was, the whole ugly shape of it, finally sitting between them like a third person in the room. Not a villain with a gun, just a system. An old, merciless machine made of bloodlines, debts, and men who'd decided decades ago that peace was only real when it was paid for with someone else's happiness. That machine didn't care about warped records or burned dinners or two, people who'd built something soft in a hard city. It didn't care that Amara had never once asked him to be anything other than himself. Machines like that never care. They just collect. Here's the part where I'd ask you, watching this unfold from somewhere safe and far from Seoul's underworld. If you were Amara, would you have begged him to stay? Or let him go for the sake of people you'd never meet? Drop your answer below, because I promise you, the syndicate elders reading these comments already have their opinion, and it's not the romantic one. If you think love should get one more night before duty collects its debt, hit that like button. The only people who won't are the ones already on the Choi family payroll. Amara didn't beg. She'd always known, somewhere under the laughter and the fitted sheet arguments, that loving a man like Kang Min-jae was like keeping a tiger as a house cat. Beautiful, dangerous, and eventually, inevitably, going to leave you with claw marks and an empty apartment. So instead of tears, she gave him something worse. She gave him a smile. Small, glassy-eyed, and devastatingly calm. "Then love me tonight," she whispered, stepping closer, "and let tomorrow hate us both." Min-jae looked at her the way a drowning man looks at shore. Too far to reach, too close to stop trying. Outside, Seoul kept spinning, unaware that in a small apartment above a bookstore, two people had just agreed to steal one final night from a future that had already been repossessed. Neither of them noticed the black sedan idling at the end of the street, engine running, waiting. They started with the record player, because some griefs are only bearable with a soundtrack. Amara dug out an old vinyl she'd bought from a flea market for $2 and a promise she'd never actually listen to it. a scratchy, warped collection of love songs from a decade before either of them was born. The needle dropped. The song wobbled in and out like a man trying to remember a language he used to speak fluently. It was, by any objective musical standard, terrible. It was perfect. Dance with me, Amara said, already kicking off her socks like they'd personally offended her. I don't dance. You run an empire of grown men who cry when you raise an eyebrow, and you're telling me you're scared of a slow song? That's different. Those men don't judge my rhythm. I absolutely will. He danced anyway, badly, stiffly, like a man who'd spent so many years controlling every variable in a room that he'd forgotten how to let one go. Amara laughed at him. The real kind. The kind that used to make him believe, just for a few hours a week, that maybe he wasn't only built for boardrooms and body counts. You dance like you're defusing a bomb, she said, spinning under his arm. In my defense, I've done that too. I was better at it. They stumbled through two more songs before attempting dinner, which went about as well as the dancing. Amara insisted she could make her grandmother's stew from memory. She could not. Smoke filled the kitchen twice, the alarm shrieking both times like it too, sensed the injustice of the evening. Min Jae, a man who'd once negotiated a truce between two syndicates over a single phone call, stood there fanning the smoke with a dish towel, laughing harder than he had in months. This, he said, coughing, is the closest either of us has come to actual arson. Don't tempt me. I know people. I know worse people. They ended up eating plain rice and leftover kimchi at the kitchen table, knees touching, laughing at a dinner that had failed spectacularly and somehow tasted like the best meal either of them had ever had. Because it wasn't about the food. It was about pretending, for one more hour, that dinner was something ordinary people got to ruin together for the rest of their lives. Somewhere between the second and third attempt to fix the stew, they started dreaming out loud. The dangerous kind of dreaming. The kind neither of them could afford. We'd have a house, Amara said, staring at the ceiling like she could already see it there. Small, not one of your marble monstrosities. Somewhere with a porch. A porch, Minjae repeated, like the word itself was foreign currency. What would I even do on a porch? Sit. Age. Complain about the neighbor's dog like a normal person instead of investigating whether the neighbors themselves are a threat. That dog could still be a threat. You're impossible. I'm thorough. We'd have kids, she added, quieter now, and the room seemed to still around the words. 2, maybe 3, and none of them would ever know your name the way this city does. They'd just know you as the guy who burns toast and can't fold a sheet. Minjae didn't answer right away. He was looking at her the way men only look at things they know they're about to lose, memorizing details on borrowed time, the curve of her laugh, the ridiculous seriousness with which she'd just designed an entire, non-existent family. They'd know me, he said finally, voice rough, as the man who loved their mother enough to let her build a life instead of a legacy. Amara's smile faltered, just slightly, the mask cracking at the edges. Don't say things like that. It's not fair. None of tonight is fair. They sat with that truth for a while, the record still spinning static and half-remembered love songs in the next room. The smoke alarm finally silent, the whole apartment humming with the sound of two people building a life they both knew would never leave this floor. Every laugh that night was a small rebellion against the sunrise creeping steadily toward them. Every joke was a goodbye wearing a disguise. Because outside, several floors below and several worlds away, a black sedan was still idling at the curb, patient, silent, and closer to the truth of tonight than either of them yet understood. Dawn in Seoul doesn't creep in politely. It arrives like an invoice, punctual, unwelcome, and impossible to argue with. The first threads of gold slid through the blinds around 5:40 a.m., painting thin, gilded lines across the wooden floor where Amara and Min-jae had danced badly just hours before. Neither of them had slept. Sleep felt like theft, stealing minutes from a night that was already running out of them. Amara was the first to notice the light. She didn't say anything at first. She just went quiet. The kind of quiet that Min-jae had learned over 2 years meant something in her was breaking in a place she refused to show him directly. It's getting late, she finally said, voice carefully light, like she was commenting on weather instead of watching a countdown reach 0. I know. You should get ready. I know that too. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The record had stopped spinning an hour ago, needle lifted, the apartment now filled with a silence that felt louder than any song. Outside, the city was waking up in its usual rhythm. Delivery trucks, the distant clatter of a shutter rolling up somewhere, a taxi honking at nothing in particular. Ordinary sounds for ordinary people on an ordinary Wednesday morning. Min Jae had never envied ordinary people until this exact moment. Amara stood, smoothing down her cardigan, and walked to the small closet by the door where she kept, despite never once admitting why, one of his suits, pressed and ready, because some nights he stayed so late there was no version of him showing up to his own estate in yesterday's hoodie. She laid it across the back of a chair with the kind of gentle precision usually reserved for handling something sacred or something already dead. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and stood in front of her while she buttoned his shirt with hands that trembled just slightly enough for him to notice, and just steadily enough that he understood she was doing everything in her power to make sure he didn't have to watch her fall apart. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, meaning the tie, meaning the buttons, meaning all of it. "I do," she said, "because if I don't, you'll walk out that door remembering me crying, and I refuse to be the last image you carry into a room full of men who will use it against you." That was the moment Min Jae understood, with a clarity sharper than any blade he'd ever ordered drawn, that the woman standing in front of him wasn't just soft in a hard world. She was strategic in the one language that had never made sense to him before, the language of protecting someone by refusing to let them see you break. She reached for his tie last, looping it with the same careful concentration she'd once used correcting his terrible dance steps. Fingers moving slow, deliberate, memorizing the motion like she already knew this was a ritual she'd be replaying in her memory for the rest of her life. "There," she said, smoothing the fabric flat against his chest. "Perfect. Terrifying. Ready to go ruin someone's Wednesday." "Amara?" "Don't," she said gently, cutting him off before the sentence could become something neither of them could survive hearing out loud. "Don't make this a speech. Just go be the man this city needs. I'll be the one who loved him before he had to become that." Min Jae reached for the door. His hand actually closed around the handle, cold brass under his palm, the black sedans outside idling like patient wolves who'd finally caught their scent. Then he stopped, because everything his empire had ever taught him, every lesson about strategy, sacrifice, and choosing the larger number over the smaller one, suddenly sounded like nonsense standing 3 feet from a woman quietly holding herself together by sheer will alone. He turned back toward her, and for one suspended second, the entire weight of Seoul's underworld, the Choi family, the 12 syndicates, and every ounce of blood-soaked history behind his name meant absolutely nothing next to the terrifying, impossible question rising in his chest. Was peace, real peace, the kind that stopped bullets and saved strangers, actually worth the price of the only person who'd ever made him feel like more than a title? His phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost ignored it. He shouldn't have. The message was from Jae Sung, his second in command, a man who never texted unless someone had died, and never called unless multiple someones had. Min Jae answered before the second ring finished. "Talk, boss." Jae Sung's voice had the particular flatness of a man trying very hard not to sound like he was panicking. "Choi Byung-ho is dead." Min Jae went very still. Byung-ho was the head of the Choi family, the man whose daughter he was supposed to marry in less than 3 hours, the architect of the entire peace arrangement. "Define dead," Min Jae said, because in his line of work, the word had layers. "Poisoned. At his own dinner table. Sometime around midnight. His people are saying it happened right after you left the estate meeting yesterday, which means whoever did it wanted it to look like I did it," Min Jae finished. "Or," Jae Sung said carefully, "like someone wanted the wedding to happen anyway, with you walking into that ceremony as the prime suspect in his murder, surrounded by every family loyal to him." "Boss, I've been going through the security details for this morning's event. Something's wrong. The guest list changed overnight. There are men on it who don't work for anyone we know, and the venue changed too. Moved to the old shipyard hall an hour ago. No announcement. No explanation." Min Jae's mind, the same mind that had never once let emotion outrun logic, began assembling the pieces with brutal, familiar clarity. A public ceremony. A dead patriarch whose death conveniently pointed at Min Jae. A guest list quietly padded with strangers. A venue switched at the last possible hour, somewhere with fewer witnesses and more shipping containers than a legitimate wedding required. This was never a peace offering. It was an execution dressed in wedding silk. They wanted a groom, Min-jae said slowly, almost admiring the architecture of it. The way you might admire a beautifully constructed bomb right before it goes off in your hands. Someone built the whole marriage as bait. Get me into a room stacked with armed men loyal to a dead patriarch, in a location with no cameras and no easy exits. And call it a wedding so nobody blinks when the groom doesn't walk out. That's my read too, Jae-sung said grimly. Question is, who benefits? Byung-ho's dead. The marriage falls apart. Both syndicates start pointing fingers. War breaks out anyway. Except now, you're not just at war, you're dead. And whoever's left standing gets to carve up both territories without lifting a single finger themselves. Min-jae looked up from the phone and found Amara watching him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not heartbreak now, but something sharper. Recognition. She'd spent 2 years listening to him talk in code about his world. She didn't need the details spelled out to understand that whatever had just landed in his hand had rewritten the entire morning. What is it? She asked quietly. The choice I thought I was making, Min-jae said, voice low, almost disbelieving of his own words. Duty versus you. It was never real. Someone built me a cage shaped like a doorway, and I was about to walk through it and call it sacrifice. For a moment, the apartment was silent, except for the distant hum of the city outside, oblivious to the fact that within its glittering skyline, someone had just tried to erase the most dangerous man in Seoul using nothing but a marriage certificate and good timing. Then Min-jae did something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. He laughed. Short, sharp, and entirely without humor. The laugh of a man who'd spent years fearing the wrong enemies while the real one had been quietly setting a table right in front of him. They wanted a groom, he repeated, straightening the tie Amara had just finished knotting, like he was arming himself instead of dressing. I think I'll give them a war instead. Amara's eyes widened, not with fear, but with something fiercer. Min-jae? I'm not walking into that hall to get married, he said, already moving toward the door with a different energy now, the stillness of grief replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. I'm walking in to find out exactly who thought they could use my own heart as a weapon against me. He paused at the doorway one last time, looking back at her, not with goodbye in his eyes this time, but with something that looked dangerously close to a promise. Wait for me, he said. Amara lifted her chin, steady now in a way that had nothing to do with pretending. I've been waiting for you every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 years. I can survive one Wednesday. The black sedans outside were no longer patient wolves waiting to escort a groom to his wedding. They were about to become getaway cars for a war. The old shipyard hall hadn't hosted an actual ship in over a decade. It sat at the edge of Incheon's industrial waterfront, all rusted gantries and echoing steel. The kind of place developers kept promising to turn into luxury waterfront lofts and never quite got around to. Someone had strung white silk drapery across the rafters anyway, and rented enough white folding chairs to seat 200 guests, as if enough flowers could convince anyone that a slaughterhouse was a chapel. Min-jae arrived exactly on time, which was itself a message. A man walking calmly into his own execution tells you everything about who actually holds the power in the room. He came without a convoy of black suits pretending to read newspapers. He came with 12 men, his best, quietest, most loyal, dressed not as bodyguards but as caterers, valets, and one deeply unconvincing florist. All of them already inside the venue an hour before Min-jae's car even pulled up. Jae-sung had spent the last 2 hours turning a wedding into a trap for the people who'd built the original trap. There is a particular vicious poetry in that kind of revenge, and Min-jae intended to enjoy every stanza of it. He walked down the makeshift aisle alone, tie straight, expression unreadable, exactly the picture of a groom too heartbroken to notice the men positioned suspiciously close to the exits. The guests, the ones who actually belonged to the Choi family, confused and grieving their murdered patriarch, watched him with a mixture of pity and unease. The guests who didn't belong, the ones added to the list overnight, watched him with the particular stillness of men waiting for a signal. At the altar, a distant cousin of Byung-ho's stood in for the missing bride, visibly uncomfortable, clearly told only that the ceremony must proceed regardless. Min-jae almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Before we begin, Min-jae said, voice carrying easily through the cavernous hall, I have a question for the room. Simple one. Who ordered the venue changed at midnight? Silence. The good kind of silence, the kind that tells you exactly who's guilty by watching whose hand twitches toward a jacket first. It was a man near the back, someone Min-jae recognized instantly, not from Choi's ranks or his own, but from the third syndicate, the smallest of the 12 families, the one everyone had spent years underestimating precisely because it had spent years being underestimated on purpose. Chairman Yu. A man so unremarkable he'd once been mistaken for a caterer at his own daughter's wedding. Chairman Yu, Min-jae said, almost warmly. I should have known. Nobody plans a funeral disguised as a wedding better than a man everyone forgets is in the room. Yu's mask slipped, just slightly. The flicker of a man realizing his elaborate architecture had just been read like a children's book. Byung-ho was a fool who thought peace could be signed like a business contract, Yu said, rising slowly. You were meant to die a martyr for it. 2 dead patriarchs, 1 dead groom, and both syndicates too busy burying their own to notice me taking everything underneath them. Ambitious, Min-jae said. Badly executed. You forgot the one rule that actually matters in this business. And what's that? Never build a trap around a man's heart, Min-jae said, without accounting for what he'll do once he realizes it. That was the signal. The florist stopped arranging flowers. The valets stopped valeting. 12 of Min-jae's best men revealed themselves not with gunfire, because a shootout in a room full of grieving relatives was exactly the kind of undisciplined chaos Yu had been counting on, but with something far more devastating to a man like Yu. Proof. Recorded confessions. Financial trails. Jae-sung had spent the last 2 hours doing what Min-jae did best, replacing bullets with leverage, blood with paperwork, revenge with something that would actually survive tomorrow's headlines. Yu's own men, seeing themselves outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and increasingly unpaid for a job that had clearly gone sideways, made the only rational decision available to men whose loyalty had always been rented, not owned. They put their hands up. Chairman Yu did not. He reached for something inside his jacket, a decision that, in this line of work, only ever ends one way. Min-jae didn't flinch. He didn't need to. Chairman Yu's hand never made it out of his jacket. One of Min-jae's men, quiet, efficient, unremarkable in the way all the best ones were, closed the distance before Yu's fingers found whatever he'd been reaching for. It ended the way these things usually did in Min-jae's world. Quickly, quietly, and without the theatrical gunfire so beloved by movies and so despised by anyone who'd ever had to clean a crime scene afterward. Yu hit the floor, disarmed, restrained, and, for the first time in a career built on being underestimated, completely, helplessly seen. You could have just asked for a bigger seat at the table, Min-jae said, crouching slightly, so you could hear him over the murmur of relieved, terrified wedding guests. Instead, you tried to build a coffin out of a marriage certificate. That's not ambition, Chairman. That's just bad math. You said nothing. Guilty men rarely do, once the room stops being theirs. By the time police sirens finally arrived, summoned not by Min-jae, who preferred his justice handled internally, but by a Choi family lawyer with impeccably poor timing, Jae-sung already had everything wrapped in a bow. Recordings, financial trails, and enough documented proof of Yu's involvement in Byung-ho's poisoning to make sure the story that reached both syndicates wasn't. The Reaper of Jonggu started a war, but Chairman Yu tried to burn down 2 empires to build himself a smaller, sadder one. In Min-jae's world, that distinction was the difference between funerals and forgiveness. The Choi family, grieving and furious, but no longer confused about who their real enemy had been, quietly withdrew the marriage arrangement within the hour. Nobody wanted a wedding built on a lie anymore. Nobody wanted a war, either. Not one that had already cost them their patriarch and nearly cost the 12 families their only functioning peace. What they wanted, more than anything, was someone to blame who wasn't already sitting comfortably at the top. Min-jae gave them exactly that. By sundown, the story moving through Seoul's underworld wasn't about a jilted engagement or a failed alliance. It was about the day Chairman Yu tried to orchestrate 2 funerals and a war, and got outmaneuvered by a man everyone assumed only understood spreadsheets and silence. Min Jae's reputation, rather than crumbling under scandal, hardened into something closer to legend. The families that had once demanded his marriage now offered him something far more valuable: distance, respect, and an unspoken agreement that nobody would ever again try to use his heart as leverage. He walked away from the shipyard hall that evening without a single drop of blood on the suit Amara had buttoned for him that morning. A small, deliberate mercy, because some victories are worth protecting from the mess. He found her exactly where he'd left her, in the apartment above the bookstore, curtains open, evening light pooling gold across the same wooden floor where they danced badly the night before. She'd changed out of the cardigan into something steadier, like she'd spent the day building armor instead of waiting. She didn't run to him. She didn't need to. She just stood in the doorway, watching him climb the last few stairs, reading everything she needed to know from the fact that he was still breathing, still whole, still his. "So," she said, arms crossed, doing an admirable job of pretending she hadn't spent the entire day rehearsing every possible version of this moment. "Did you get married?" "No." "Did you start a war?" "Ended one, actually. Started a very satisfying arrest instead." Amara exhaled, long, shaking, relieved in a way that finally let the mask she'd worn all morning crack completely. "You're an idiot," she said, closing the distance between them. "A reckless, dramatic, terrifying idiot. I prefer thorough. You prefer being right," she said, "which is somehow worse." He pulled her into him anyway, and for the first time since the phone call that started this entire nightmare, the silence between them wasn't a countdown to goodbye. It was just quiet, ordinary, theirs. Because some love stories end in wedding bells, and some end in funerals. But this one, against every rule Seoul's underworld had ever written, ended exactly where it began. In a small apartment above a bookstore, with a woman who never asked Kang Min-jae to be anyone except himself, and a man who'd finally learned that the empire worth protecting was the one with a porch, bad dancing, and burnt rice for dinner.